Hey everybody, and welcome to this lecture on operant conditioning. We're just going to review really fast. The definition of learning was the relatively permanent change in an organism's behavior due to experience. And so your learning objective for this lecture is that by the end of this lecture, you should be able to contrast between both classical conditioning and operant conditioning. You should also be able to distinguish between positive and negative reinforcements and positive and negative punishments. So let's get started with operant conditioning. Operant conditioning, let's go back to classical conditioning. If you remember correctly, classical conditioning is that the learner really is passive. They are acting on really their reflex is acting on a stimulus, and they're not really making a choice at all. But in operant conditioning, the learner is making a choice because it's based on consequence. It might be a reward, it might be a punishment. And so that is what operant conditioning is. Let's get the real definition though. The learning of voluntary behavior through the effect of pleasant and unpleasant consequences to responses. Now, here's the deal. I know that all of you have participated in operant conditioning. Usually as a child, what happened when you disobeyed? You might get in trouble. What happened when you did something really good? You may have been rewarded. That reward was meant to reinforce the positive behavior, whereas the punishment may have been to try to dissuade the behavior that they did not want you to do. We have lots of graphics in the slideshow. Okay, so let's start with a guy by the name of Thorndike, which Thorndike's principles state that if an action is followed by a pleasurable consequence, it will tend to be repeated, and if followed by an unpleasant consequence, it will tend not to be repeated. This was known as the law of effect. Now, I know many of you might be going, what? That's just like no-brainer. Everybody knows that. If I like something, then I'm going to do something more. If I don't like it, then I'm not going to do it anymore. Yeah, but you know what? If you put it in writing, then you'll become famous, and that's what Thorndike did. Early operant conditioning. Okay, so what Thorndike did was he took this box, and we call it a puzzle box, and basically he put a cat in it, and it had all kinds of levers and all kinds of things, and the cat would have to try to figure out how to get out of the box. So it would push at the ceiling, dig at the floor, howl, and do all kinds of things until it would finally press the lever. After many trials, basically the cat continued to push at the ceiling, dig at the floor, howl, but eventually it would get to the thing that would actually release it, which was press the lever. The cat wasn't very smart in the fact that it didn't figure out just to press the lever, but it knew that one of those things would get it out. It would give it a reward. A guy by the name of B.F. Skinner basically took Thorndike's law and used it as his starting point. He developed what is now known as, well, it's known by two names, the operant chamber or a Skinner box, to study operant conditioning. And what you're looking at in these graphics or in these pictures is a picture of an actual Skinner box or operant chamber. Let me give you a quick tour of what this looks like. So right here, there's a water dispenser, there's a food dispenser, there is a lever for the rat to press, a light, and a speaker. Also, this floor is a grid that can be electrified. Don't worry, we did not fry any rats in the experiments. It's something we'll teach you about what the rat was trying to avoid pain. So here's another picture of it. So basically, rats were placed in the Skinner box, and they did what we called shaping to get closer and closer to the bar in order to receive food. So I have a question. Have any of you ever played the hot and cold game with your parents? I know with my family, it was always like during Easter when we did the Easter egg hunts. My family, the Easter bunny. Anyways, the Easter bunny would hide the eggs, and it was my job, of course, to find them. And so always there was a couple of eggs that I really struggled in finding. And so my parents would play the hot and cold game. And as I would get closer to wherever the egg was, they'd go, "You're getting hotter. You're getting hotter." And if I moved away, they'd be like, "Oh, you're getting colder. Oh, you're freezing cold. Oh, wait, you're getting hot. You're red hot." Until I finally got to the place that I needed to find the egg at. Well, this is the same thing with shaping. At every step of the way, basically we reward the rat. So if we wanted them to press the lever, let's say that's our goal with the rat, that every time they get close to the lever, we disperse food. And until they actually do the desired behavior. Now, eventually, of course, the rat is required to press the bar to receive the food, and so this is what shaping looks like. Food, of course, is a reinforcer. Okay, you don't have to write this down, but we're just going to... Actually, you can write down the definition for shaping. Do we wait for subjects to deliver the desired behavior? Or sometimes we use that process called shaping. Shaping is reinforcing simple steps on the way to the desired behavior. So let's say we wanted to train a dog to get your slippers. You would have to reinforce him in small steps. First to find the slippers. Then you put them in his mouth. Then you'd train him to bring them to you, and so on. This is shaping behavior. So if we were actually in class, I would be asking right now for a volunteer. Do I have any? I know we can't do this in real life, but like I said, if we were in the classroom setting, I usually ask for a volunteer, and I send them down the hallway. And while they're down the hallway, I explain to the class what we're going to do. Our goal is we want our volunteer to write their name on the board, but we can't tell them. How we're going to reinforce them is through applause. And so as they walk into the room, and the closer they get to the chalkboard, of course, we end up applauding them. Now, they are so confused, as would be a rat. Now, a person can talk and communicate, but a rat can't. And so the poor rat gets very confused. So we give them these rewards as we go along. Okay, so we also can do what's called chaining behaviors, which is as subjects are taught a number of responses successively in order to get a reward. Now, I know it says to click on these examples. I don't have the links in there, but basically these two pictures show really some interesting things. The first one is they've actually taught pigeons how to play ping pong. And then they show a rat chaining behavior to do the different things to get the reward. Okay, so in classical conditioning, if you remember, we had some very specific terminology. Well, basically, operant conditioning has the very same terms. So if I wanted to reinforce my son's dancing by giving him a lollipop when he dances, identify what the following would be, okay? Acquisition. If you remember, acquisition is the process of basically connecting all of the dots, right? That if this happens, then this happens. So we have to show my son that if he dances, he gets a lollipop, and making that connection for him is acquisition. Extinction is, well, hey, we stop giving him the lollipop, and eventually he's going to stop dancing. Spontaneous recovery, though, we start giving him the lollipop again, and he will begin to dance once again. Generalization. Well, let's say I want my son to only dance to Michael Jackson's Thriller, but now he dances to every song that comes on the radio. I teach him to discriminate in what songs he dances to. So we're going to talk about reinforcers and punishments and the difference between those two. So reinforcers are anything that increases a behavior. That is key when trying to determine in your homework, is this a reinforcement or is this a punishment? Are we trying to increase somebody's behavior, or are we trying to decrease the behavior? If it's decreasing, it will always be considered a punishment. If it's trying to increase the behavior, it is always going to be a reinforcement. So under reinforcement, there are two different kinds. There is positive reinforcements and negative reinforcements. And this is where things really start getting confusing, because again, there is going to be a positive punishment and a negative punishment. But let's start with our reinforcers. A positive reinforcer is when a pleasant consequence follows a response, making the response more likely to recur. Where a negative reinforcement is when an unpleasant consequence is removed following a response, making the response more likely to occur. So let's give you some examples of each to kind of solidify in your mind what this really looks like. Okay. Oh, actually, first let's talk about the difference between primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are basically anything that naturally is reinforcing, like food and water, connection, human contact with people. These would be primary reinforcers. Secondary are conditioned reinforcers. They're things that we've paired with primary, that we've made valuable, even though in and of themselves they may not be, such as praise, tokens, gold stars. A token economy would be under secondary reinforcers. So probably if you think back in elementary school, you had some class at some point that worked on, like you as a class had to work on either gaining points or maybe marbles in a jar or something like that, and that when you did something good as a class, your teacher would add marbles or add points, and the idea was to collect those and eventually get a reward. The tokens themselves were really worth nothing. It's what those tokens either got you or what they represented. Okay, so let's give you some examples back to positive reinforcers. Well, of course, being applauded for, being said, good job. Anytime somebody pays you a compliment, that is a positive reinforcer. Have you ever worn an outfit, and maybe this is, I don't know, this is for either girls or guys. You wear an outfit and you get a compliment on it. Aren't you more likely to wear that outfit again, right? You're like, hey, I look good, and people recognized it. Hey, if any of you have a job, what's your positive reinforcement for going to work? A paycheck. That's right, it is a positive reinforcer. Now, that piece of paper in and of itself doesn't hold any value, but we've made it valuable in that it represents money. I have yogurt on here, but the idea is dessert. Sometimes, you get rewarded dessert if you eat your veggies during dinner or something like that. These are all positive reinforcements. Okay, so what is a negative reinforcement? Here's where people do get confused, and they honestly use them as, they get them confused with punishments. A negative reinforcer is not a punishment. So here are your examples of negative reinforcers. It's basically taking away something negative as a reward. So the center picture is the one that I use as an example most. If you have a newer car, if you do not wear your seatbelt, what does it do? Ding, 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 until you put that seatbelt in and click it in. Then that dinging, that annoying noise goes away. We have removed a negative thing by doing something positive. We are wanting you to increase the behavior of wearing your seatbelt, and so we take away that noise, that ear-piercing noise, whenever you do the thing we want you to do. These other two pictures are just different examples. I have this one as an example of, if you do your, if you are organized and we will take off maybe some of your work, right? If you can, if things are overwhelming, we take away some of your work in order as a reward. Horses, believe it or not, if you are a horse person, they use negative reinforcement all the time. You take the pressure off of a horse when it goes the direction you want it to go. And so that is just another example. So let's test your knowledge on positive or negative reinforcers. You get to guess which is a positive and which is negative. Okay, so I kind of already gave you the first answer, but putting on your seatbelt. If you guessed negative reinforcer, you got it right, plus you cheated because we just said it. But how about studying for a test? Is that a positive or a negative? If you guessed positive, you are absolutely correct, because when you study, we give you good grades, right? And so that is a positive reinforcement. Here's a good one, having a headache and taking an aspirin. Well, the aspirin is meant to take away the pain, so it is actually a negative reinforcer. It's taking away that annoying pain in your head. Ooh, how about faking sick to avoid, well, we're not teaching AP Psych here, but avoid taking a class, right? What is that? Is it a positive or a negative? Well, I'm guessing it has to do with how you see the class, but I guess is if you're avoiding it, you don't like it. So that would be a negative reinforcer. Breaking out of jail. Honestly, I think it could go either way, depending on how you look at it. If you're gaining your freedom, then that's a positive reinforcement. If you are fleeing incarceration, it is a negative reinforcer. Getting a kiss for doing the dishes. That would be a positive reinforcer. Okay, we do have a principle known as the PREMAC principle. This states that opportunities to engage in a preferred activity can be used to reinforce a less preferred activity. Maybe you've done this to encourage yourself or as an incentive to do homework. Maybe it's, you know what? I'm going to study now so I can go out with my friends later. Or I'll do this first so that I can follow up with having my snack or eating a bowl of ice cream or whatever the positive, more preferred activity is. Okay, let's now get to punishments. So we talked about how reinforcers are anything that increases behavior. Punishment is anything that decreases behavior. And again, there is a positive punishment and a negative punishment. Your positive punishment, well, it's when an unpleasant consequence follows a response, making that response less likely to recur. Your negative punishment is when a pleasant consequence is removed following a response, making that response again less likely to recur. So let's look at some examples of each of these. Oh, there are always rules for punishment, and I will be very honest, these are very important. Number one, the punishment really needs to follow the unacceptable behavior immediately in order to get the best connection with, hey, you behave this way, here's the consequence. It also has to be consistent. I knew a family once who mom was super inconsistent with her punishments. She would, I'm going to change their names to protect the guilty, of course, but let's say their name was John, okay? So this is the child's name. And mom would be like, John, stop. John, stop. John, knock it off. John, John, John. John didn't stop until mom had it like up to here and pretty much like spanked the kid and ground him for life, and it was all ugly. She was very inconsistent. Well, because John never had consistent discipline, John ended up getting into some big trouble. He ended up breaking into a building and doing some vandalism when he was about in the 6th grade. The next thing is he got caught. And I have to tell you, this was a long time ago. This is before surveillance cameras were everywhere. So I'm not even sure how they caught John, but John got caught. So the police show up to John's 6th grade class and like do the perp walk out of the 6th grade class. And everybody's like, oh, John's busted, man. Well, John and his mom have to go to court, and the court basically mandates them to go to family counseling. And I will tell you as a counselor, I would never say this because it's wrong to say, but the counselor basically said, if you threaten to break John's arm, you better be willing to break John's arm. Don't break anybody's arm. But the idea is being consistent. I always tell parents, and I'll tell you, don't ever threaten to give a consequence you're not willing to give. I've had clients threaten to take away, grandparent time. But they had no intention of taking away grandparent time. Well, then don't use it as a threat. Your kid will get your number pretty quickly, as I'm sure you've gotten that number if you've ever had somebody do that to you. So the idea is be consistent with follow through, and that will have the most success with punishment. The last thing but not least is it needs to be paired whenever possible with reinforcement of correct behavior. So if, let's say, we're working with a child and the child has done something naughty, of course we have to correct them, and that means that we may have to punish them. But if we can have them do kind of what I call a redo, then we can reinforce the good behavior that they've done. So those are the rules for punishment. Okay, examples of positive punishment. So remember, this is when we are giving something negative, or we're giving a punishment that's negative in order to decrease the behavior. So if you are speeding, which I know none of you would do, we give you a traffic ticket, right? We're giving that traffic ticket in of itself doesn't really have any power, but it does represent you having to pay a fine and usually go maybe to traffic school or something, right? So that ends up being a negative, and so the idea is to try to decrease you from speeding. Ooh, if you blew off that test and you failed the grade, then hopefully that positive punishment will be negative enough in your life to cause you to study. We want to decrease the idea of blowing off tests. Okay, this last one is a dog shock collar. I don't use dog shock collars, but I do know people who do, especially those with large properties. But the idea sometimes is that if the dog barks too much, or if a dog, sometimes it's the electric fence kind of situation, that it gives them a buzz when they're doing a behavior that they're not supposed to do, that we're trying to decrease. So if the dog is barking too much, it buzzes on them when they bark. Or if they, like I said, go out of bounds, it buzzes them as a positive punishment. It's giving them a shock. Examples of negative punishment is having positive things taken away, which probably all of you have had at some point in your life. Maybe it was your cell phone. I know we can't live without our cell phones, but that is considered a negative punishment because it's taking away something we like. Maybe it's you didn't eat all of your veggies, your Brussels sprouts are still on the plate, you don't get dessert. We took that away. Or maybe you don't get to go to the party tonight. You are grounded because you did something. You weren't where your parents told you to be. Those are examples of negative punishment. So that's it for operant conditioning. Join me for the next slideshow to really finish up this chapter on learning.